This is being sponsored by the Junius Institute, and there are 4 panelists whom I will introduce at this point in the sequence in which they will make their 8 to 10 or 12-minute presentations. David Noe is an associate professor of classics at Calvin College, a ruling elder at Redeemer Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Ada, Michigan, translator of Junius's treatise on true theology, a focus of tonight's attention, and an editorial collaborator on Petrus van Maastricht's Theoretical and Practical Divinity, a project of the Dutch Reformed Translation Society. Dr. Richard Muller is the P.J. Zondervan Professor of Historical Theology here at Calvin Seminary, author of the landmark multi-volume Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, and the renowned interpreter and reinterpreter of that field in numerous monographs, academic articles, and reviews. Mr. Todd Rester is director of the Junius Institute, translator of the Van Maastricht title that I've just mentioned, and an ABD PhD student here at Calvin Seminary. And finally, Dr. David Sytsma is an adjunct professor here at the seminary. He's the research coordinator of the Junius Institute and the project director of the Post-Reformation Digital Library, a project of the Junius Institute. He's also responsible for designing the digital companion for Franciscus Junius's treatise on true theology, which he's going to demonstrate for us tonight as part of his presentation. The procedure is going to be this. We're going to give each panelist, in the order I've introduced them, 8 to 10 minutes to make a presentation on the topic they'll designate to you. Then I will allow each of them to make one comment or question to a fellow panelist, and more if it doesn't exceed 15 to 20 minutes. And the rest of the time, hopefully 20 minutes or 25 minutes until 8 o'clock when we'll terminate, will be up to you. The floor will be open for your questions and discussion. So we're going to begin with you, David. Please introduce your topic and get us started.
Thank you. Well, it's a privilege and pleasure for me to be here this evening and to see all of you come out to hear us speak about Franciscus Junius, his life and his thought, and other things of that nature, and also to ask us questions and hopefully interact with us in a meaningful way later on this evening. I'm a simple Latinist, a humble translator of Franciscus Junius, and it was really quite a learning experience for me to go through this treatise as well as his life. It's a very dense treatise. I'm sure you all have read it already. Yes? My topic this evening is to talk briefly about the life portion of Francis Junius's work, the Vita, which was a preface to the work which was published in the early 1590s, the Treatise on True Theology. And so I want to begin with a quote from Paulus Mariula, who also wrote a preface to the first edition of this work. It was published in 1594. Concerning this publication, says Mariula, Junius shared not even one word when he was writing the account of his own life. If he had denied my request to write this account, the Christian Church, which has a very keen interest in not disregarding these events, would have been compelled to suffer this loss. Or if he had agreed, those who wished him ill would have objected that this great man was hunting for his own glory. Surely different people will be instructed in different ways from this, meaning from the account. I think that really sets the tone of what the life of Junius shows us about the man and the times. As Mariula says, different people will be instructed in different ways from this. And then he goes on to list a variety of persons that he thinks will benefit greatly from reading Junius's life, his autobiography. And of course, you then, if you read it, stand in the same tradition that Mariula sort of outlined in the preface to that work. After talking about the political authorities who will take from Junius's discussion what a fragile thing it is to have peace and to have peace for the church, Mariola proceeds to talk about the other groups that stand to learn a great deal from Junius's biography. He says, the shepherds of souls will see how numerous are the difficulties to which ministers of the church will be led. They will see how many crises, how many sorrows, how many slanders accompany all forms of leadership, even in the church. Parents will understand what their duty is in training their children, that they must be taught true religion and equipped above all for divine worship. Children from this publication, you see, Mariola is very comprehensive in what he thinks is the value of Junius's Vita. Children will learn to submit themselves, you ready? Will learn to submit themselves willingly to their parents' judgment. I didn't find, as I translated it, and as I am both a parent and a son myself, that this was necessarily true. And yet, as you read through the autobiography, you'll find that Junius tells a very compelling story about his development as a scholar, as a Christian thinker, and about some of the obstacles and advantages that he enjoyed in that pursuit. Teachers, he says, will see that they must refrain from applying the rod, that there should be no blazing anger, no raging like Orbilius. Orbilius here is a reference to a famous Roman pedagogue who was the instructor of the Roman poet Horace. And of him, Horace says that he was plagosus, filled with blows, filled with rods, constantly disciplining his students corporally so that they might learn. And one of the points that makes is that Junius is in some ways very much a child of his times. He stands really, and others can speak more intelligently about this than I can, I'm sure, but he stands really kind of at the beginning of the tradition of Protestant erudition, and he's very important in establishing that tradition, in fact. And it's a tradition that was built on a very thorough understanding of the ancient world and its forms, a knowledge that was bequeathed to Junius and his contemporaries largely through the conduit of the Renaissance. These are the things that Mariola says any student of Junius's life can learn. He goes on in that fashion. So then I'd like to direct your attention to the very first page of the Vita. And I'd like to read to you not from the beginning of Junius's Vita itself, but from something else. And I'll see first if any of you recognize it before I reveal the provenience of this quote. You are great, Lord, and highly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is immeasurable. Man, a little piece of your creation, desires to praise you, a human being bearing his mortality with him, carrying with him the witness of his sin and the witness that you resist the proud. Nevertheless, to praise you is the desire of man, a little piece of your creation. You stir men to take pleasure in praising you because you have made us for yourself. This is going to give it away. And our heart is restless until it rests in you. Now, those of you who are somewhat familiar with the tradition of Christian autobiography know that this is the seminal work in that tradition. It is the Confessions of St. Augustine. And it's Henry Chadwick's translation from Oxford. And then I'd like to read to you the first paragraph of Junius's Vita so that you can see the point I'm trying to make. The Lord's mercies I shall relate when I give an account of my poor life, that the Lord who made me may be glorified in me. Yet thou, O Lord, open my lips, that my mouth may proclaim thy praise. Guide my spirit, that now and in my whole life I may make known thy faithfulness and truth. In thy presence, O Lord, I shall speak of myself, and I would rather speak of thee, O Lord, at work within me. So I will proclaim the truth which by thy careful providence thou didst want to be revealed in me by thine endless mercy. The point I'm seeking to establish that I hope is evident from the reading of those two quotations is that it's fairly clear Junius sees his life in the flow of the Christian tradition. He is not writing this autobiography de novo. He is patterning himself, I think, quite self-consciously on the greats like Augustine who have gone before him. We'll see other indications of that in the few moments that I have remaining this evening. If you'll bear with me a second. At a certain point in his autobiography, Junius quotes a maxim, a proverb, a Latin phrase that he says was very popular in France at the time, viam scholae esse longissimam, which means the path of study or the path of scholarship is very, very long. And this is borne out in Junius's life in quite some remarkable way. He says, I began my primary studies as soon as I had reached my 5th year, under the very genial tutelage of my father. This happened as often as he had time to return home to care for my illness, which he mentions earlier, for I was now much stronger. And Junius's life, as I've said before, is very characteristic of other learned men of his time. They began their studies, of course, at a very tender age. The studies consisted almost exclusively of literature and language. Junius, like many others, including Calvin, later moved on into the study of law. Junius never lost his passion for classical literature and for the literature of the intervening periods. And if you go on from reading the autobiography to read the actual treatise, you'll find that in several places Junius references a host of classical authors. It's very difficult to tell, a point that I make in the preface, whether Junius knew these authors firsthand, men like Cicero, Seneca, Lucretius, Virgil, and so forth, or whether he knew them only from handbooks or because the kinds of quotes that he recounts were very common and popular among other scholars at the time. But we do know for sure that Junius was reading Cicero, because he tells us, and that he was reading Lucretius, who is a Roman poet who's famous for his Epicureanism. And in fact, the Epicureanism of Lucretius, he tells us at one point, drew him away from the faith, and it was only the careful pastoral interest of his father that finally brought him back to the faith. And so in one memorable passage, again tracing the trajectory of Augustine, Junius describes how his father casually left the Gospel of John open in the room. And Junius then just happened to stumble upon it. And as he read from that first chapter, he had an epiphany sort of moment in which the light of the gospel broke through on his mind and he was converted. Now, I think that story is probably accurate and historically valid, but it also is highly reminiscent of the story that Augustine tells in the Confessions about taking and reading from Romans and finding himself in the pages of that book. This is a theme that Junius is developing consistently across the course of his autobiography. We might say two themes. The theme of his how he is like Augustine and other famous Christian biographers of the past, and also that he is set for a life of scholarship first and foremost, that the road of scholarship is very long indeed. How am I doing for time?
You're just about there.
Okay. There is so much that I could say. I think I will I'll share with you just one more quote that I think is indicative of Junius's character and indicative of the life of scholars, perhaps at least many scholars, quite generally. He says, "By the goodness of God, I happily advanced in my pursuit of education, both as these men," he has just listed a number of famous pedagogues in France at the time, "both as these men," I'm sorry, I lost my spot. "Both as these men demonstrated faithfulness in their teaching, and as nature led me as a boy to a more than adequate desire for praise and distinction. For that wicked root of the love of honor, philotimeos, was growing up in me, so that in my sinfulness I could not endure with a calm heart, even at that age, to have someone else praised. Nor could I be at peace with that self-evaluation which I was achieving by the most focused effort. And so God in his far-reaching wisdom made use of these wicked motives for my benefit, as he pitied me. In addition to my studies at school, as well as those that took place at home, there were constant matters of business that concerned my father as a very important man of the highest judgment. At my tender age, he also helped me by these responsibilities to combine a knowledge of human affairs with my pursuit of learning." So I'll conclude with that and just make the point that not only did Junius have all the benefits and advantages of being schooled by famous tutors in a more formal setting, but his father, as an accomplished jurist and a man of learning, also taught him at home Greek, Latin, Hebrew from a very young age. And it's Junius's view of his own life that the Lord used his natural propensities as well as the hardness of his circumstances to shape him into a scholar and also as a pastor. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Noe. Professor Muller, we turn to you.
Well, thank you, and welcome. I hope that by the time I'm done, I can convince you of the title of my little piece. Oh, sorry about that. I hope I can convince you of the title of my little piece, which is The Importance of Being Junius. The name Franciscus Junius is admittedly not very well known today. Hopefully, the publication of the On True Theology will begin to remedy that situation. Junius, though, was very widely known and profoundly respected in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. A skilled linguist, a major biblical translator and commentator, significant theological formulator, and perhaps most of all, as a teacher. His literary output was extensive. His collected works in 1608 occupy 2 folio volumes of over 2,000 finely printed double-column pages. What I'd like to do this evening is simply to note several of his achievements in 3 different areas of emphasis: the doctrinal, the exegetical, and what can loosely be called the curricular. First, Junius' importance, doctrinally. I learned of Junius initially when I studied the theology of Jacob Arminius and encountered the, quote, friendly conference of James Arminius with Mr. Franciscus Junius about predestination, a work published not in any collection of Junius writings, but instead as a posthumous work of Arminius in 1613. Arminius wrote out a series of comments on predestination and sent them on to Junius as the beginning of a written dialogue or conference. Junius divided the arguments up into sections and commented on each section. Arminius responded to Junius' comments. Why Junius made no further comment beyond that remains an unanswered historical question. But as it stands, the friendly conference provides a window into the doctrine of predestination as it was formulated in the era of early orthodoxy, a salient feature of Junius' argumentation, which Arminius, as well as various later Reformed writers, would have done well to have pondered a bit more closely, was Junius' effort to show that supra- and infralapsarian understandings of the divine decrees were quite compatible, given that God eternally has knowledge both of all possibility and of all the possibilities that he was going to actualize. This understanding, which did carry over into the thought of various of Junius' students and successors, may very well be the underlying reason that Gomarus, a former student and colleague of Junius, could subscribe to the overtly infralapsarian canons of Dort. Beyond this, however, Junius was renowned in his time for a series of major treatises, among them the treatise on True Theology, here for the first time translated to English. The work provided several generations of Protestant theologians with the first fully developed prolegomena to theology, and in it, a paradigm for understanding the nature of human theology based on revelation and formulated in the context of human sinfulness. At a time when plagiarism was often an indication of the importance of a work, it's clear that On True Theology was deemed highly important. Junius was also one of the major defenders of the doctrine of the Trinity against Polish anti-Trinitarians, identified polemically by Junius as adoptionists, and falling into the ancient errors of Paul of Samosata. The work stands at 3 volumes. Second, then, his labors as an exegete, translator, and commentator. Despite the importance of his treatise on True Theology, Junius' linguistic efforts were really the source of his great fame and his impact on his immediate contemporaries. Perhaps most significant was his collaboration with Emmanuel Tremellius in an annotated translation from the original languages of the Bible into Latin. The translation they produced enjoyed a normative status among Protestants, both for the accuracy of its renderings and for its marginal annotations. Junius' annotations on the Revelation were ultimately incorporated into the New Testament of the Geneva Bible toward the end of the 17th century. Junius was also recognized as a significant commentator on Scripture, who wrote on Genesis, Jonah, Jude, and Revelation, plus a prolegomenon to the study of the Psalter, and a work examining the Old Testament quotations found in the New Testament. His interpretation of Revelation, which placed the millennium from AD 70 to 1072, that's about 1,000 years, from the destruction of the temple, quote, unto the time of Gregory VII who waxed mad against the emperor, unquote. Highly influential in its time, and is the only work of Junius previously translated into English. It remains of interest as an indicator of the fact that Reformed eschatology never really was amillennial. Third, Junius' curricular efforts, which account for a large portion of his theology as well. There's a set of theses for disputation that survives from Junius' tenure at the University of Heidelberg, which extend from the prolegomenal definition of theology to the topics of Scripture, God, providence, and creation. After Junius had established himself in the theological faculty at Leiden, He continued to produce sets of theses for disputation, but he also examined the way in which disputations, extended final oral exams, for degrees were handled, and he found it rather haphazard, with little topical order among the disputations. He may have begun to address the problem during his time at Heidelberg, but at Leiden he was able to achieve a significant resolution. What he proposed was an orderly sequencing of the topics, beginning with prolegomenal issues and extending into the topics of Scripture, God, creation, providence, and so forth. Arguably the paradigm for understanding theology detailed in On True Theology that provided a kind of foundation for those disputations. They would then be prepared and conducted by the faculty in an order based on seniority, beginning with the first topic and beginning again with that topic when the sequence was completed. By 1609, not quite a decade after his death, the Leiden faculty was engaged in the fifth sequence of disputations, and that approach continued down through the century. The result of this approach was both an orderly curriculum and a full body of doctrine, compiled and supervised by the theological faculty and representative of what could be called a public or institutional theology. You knew what they taught at Leiden when you saw the publication. Beyond this, over the course of several years, members of the faculty would each have produced the larger part of a basic synopsis of theology. On a completion of a full doctrinal cycle, and the pattern repeated, the theologian would eventually produce many of the disputations himself. The yield of this project was a fairly complete body of divinity from Junius himself, and lengthy sets of disputations furnishing nearly complete theologies for the next several generations at Leiden, namely Gomarus, Arminius, Franciscus Junius, and then ultimately the authors of the Leiden synopsis. Well, what then of the importance of being Junius? Junius was a key figure in the development of Reformed thought in an era that's been identified as early orthodoxy, running from around 1565 to around 1640. In one sense, he was a transitional figure who bridged two eras. He had migrated to Switzerland and met such Reformation-era luminaries as Peter Martyr Vermigli, Heinrich Bullinger, Rudolf Gualter, and Guillaume Farel. Junius studied biblical languages in Geneva, arriving too late, 1562, to have had much personal contact with Calvin. While in Geneva, however, he worked through Calvin's institutes, sermons, and commentaries, and he studied Beza's Confession as a kind of synopsis of Reformed thought. When he migrated to Heidelberg as a new professor, he delivered his inaugural disputation under Johann Jakob Grenäus, one of the major teachers of the day. And among his students, he numbered a series of theological teachers of the next generation, among them Franciscus Gomarus, Johannes Polyander, both later professors at Leiden, Bartholomeus Koppen, who's not that well known, but later professor of Hebrew and theology at Heidelberg, and a lesser but nonetheless significant student named Johannes Milius of Bremen. Junius thus knew and was influenced by major reformers of the second generation, became a major formulator in his own generation, and served as a teacher of the next generation, which included the theologians who attended, some of them, the Synod of Dort. In the memorial written by Paulus Merula, he was praised as having been a man born to teach others, a helmsman in the stormy era of the Netherlands. Andreas Ravitas, member of a later generation of Leiden professors, referred to Junius as Doctor Subtilissimus, perhaps remembering that the great Duns Scotus had just been Doctor Subtilis, a most acute and discriminating teacher, and as a diligent searcher after truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Muller. And for that, we turn to you, Mr. Rester.
Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit, and we will talk about Franciscus Junius at the intersection between theology and law. On the 12th of October, 1593, Junius dedicated a rather brief treatise entitled On the Observance of the Mosaic Polity, or in Latin, De Politiae Mossis Observatione, to the legislative body of the states Holland and West Friesland. This work endeavors to answer the rather thorny question buried in its subtitle: what part of the Mosaic polity must and must not be observed among the people of God after grace and truth have been accomplished through Christ and after the gospel had been promulgated? In short, What role does the Mosaic polity play in a Christian republic such as the Dutch Republic at the close of the 16th century? To answer this question, Junius deploys multiple elements from his legal and theological studies, as well as many of the classical references therein. With respect to his legal studies, Junius trained in his hometown of Bourges for about 2 years under such Protestant jurists as Hugo de Nellis, François Douarin, Antonius Contius, and Ludwig Roussard. These jurists were known for their use of a humanist methodology in the establishment of the text of the classic monument of Roman jurisprudence, the Corpus Juris Civilis, that is, the body of civil law, as well as their efforts to delineate a unifying method from it to establish the science of law. De Nellis and Douarin, for example, have been classed as use naturalists, to be distinguished from later Enlightenment thinkers that would speak of like, say, for example, Hobbes or Locke. Has been classed as use naturalists, that is, those who claim that human rights are not derived from human positive law, but are rooted in participation in God's goodness. Throughout the De Politiae, Junius argues along lines consonant with this legal theory, that the general principles of the moral law are evident throughout antiquity, and in this way he argues for a consensus gentium, a consensus of moral principles found in pagan antiquity that in some measure agree with the moral principles of natural law. He argues more precisely that these moral principles are best illustrated in the inspired positive law given to Moses, although there are significant differences in application that must be accommodated to time, place, culture, and circumstance. The project of this little work, from this perspective, touches upon a theological assumption that the moral law of God is written on the heart of humanity and is evident in varying degree in the conscience and jurisprudence of the nations. With respect to his theological studies, Junius studied in Geneva during the tenure of Calvin and Beza. It is no surprise, then, that Junius deploys their approach to the Mosaic law as divided into 3 forms: moral, ceremonial, and judicial law. What may come as a surprise to some is that Junius expounds these aspects of the Mosaic polity in tandem with distinctions that find their roots in the natural law tradition of Thomas Aquinas. Without citing Aquinas directly by name, Junius does deploy distinctions that have a Thomist ring to them. For example, consider some of Junius's theses. I'm starting with 1, and I'll read through thesis 5. Law is the ordering of reason to the common good, established by the one who has care of the community. This law is either eternal, think of the immutable concept and form of reason existing before all time in God, the Prince of the universe, or informed and declared in time. That law that is in time is either the natural law or that which advenes to nature. The natural law is that which is innate to creatures endowed with reason and informs them with common notions of nature, that is, with principles and conclusions adumbrating a certain participation in the eternal law. That which advenes to nature arises to it spontaneously or is infused. We call the latter a divine law and the former a human one. Now, if you turn to Thomas's Summa Theologica, hear Thomas. I answer that a law is nothing else but a dictate of practical reason emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community. Now, it is evident, granted that the world is ruled by divine providence, that the whole community of the universe is governed by divine reason. Wherefore, the very idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. And since the divine reason's conception of things is not subject to time, but is eternal, according to Proverbs 8:23, therefore, it is that this kind of law must be called eternal. So when you turn to Junius, you'll see distinctions like eternal law, moral law, natural law, human law, these sorts of things. If you compared Junius's theses 3 and 4 with Thomas, you would hear this. The rational creature is this is Thomas. The rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence, by being provident both for itself and for others. Therefore, it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation in the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So then the psalmist, after saying, offer up the sacrifice of justice, as though someone asked what the works of justice are, adds, many say, who will show us any good? In answer to which question he says, the light of thy countenance, O Lord, is shined upon us, thus implying that the light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing other than an imprint upon us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing other than the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. So you see some similarities here in language and thought. Just as a summary so far, eternal law is God's conception of good that is indistinguishable from him. Thus it is infinite, eternal, and so forth. Natural law is what forms and supplies common notions to rational human beings. This can occur in a human way through deliberation and reason, or in a divine way through special revelation. Human law is deduced for the common good. Divine law, however, is delivered for a specific supernatural goal. Now we turn to that thorny question. The Mosaic law, according to Junius, has an immutable part inasmuch as it speaks to the common good on the basis of natural law. On the other hand, the Mosaic law, to the extent that it teaches something specific with respect to a supernatural and special good, is mutable. So, for example, the judicial laws of Israel, which respect murder, theft, and so forth, illustrate immutable principles of God's goodness. But laws which are ceremonial in nature are mutable, as they are given for a specific, symbolic, and redemptive purpose. Thus, the Mosaic law must be considered in terms of whether it is speaking of the Jews as human beings, that is, with respect to general equity, or if it is speaking to the Jews as Jews, those in covenant with God. Junius makes this point. Yet there is one further complication. Junius asserts that, quote, the majority of these cases are commandments that have a composite rationale from the moral, judicial, and ceremonial law and are not of only one kind. Thus, it cannot be the case that these laws can be enacted wholesale in the Republic, as some elements do represent principles of common equity, but there are others which illustrate principles of grace. Even among those laws that illustrate principles of common equity, a distinction must be observed between what is due to the moral law and what is particular to the civil polity of the nation of Israel. Now, as this brief overview has demonstrated, I think, Junius's thought on this question is, well, subtle and careful. He is simultaneously engaging the legal thought of his day and bringing it into conversation with a rich Christian understanding of God, the moral law, and specific administrations of law in the civil realm. At no point in the treatise does Junius presume as a theologian to do the civil magistrate's job in establishing specific policies, but rather he seeks to remind the magistrate of its duty to pursue the common good. And to the extent that the Mosaic polity reflects principles of the moral law for the common good, it must be followed by the magistrate. To the extent that the Mosaic polity is a mixture of ceremonial laws and context-specific judicial determinations, it cannot be followed by the magistrate. So rather than concluding, I will simply note with extreme interest that Junius utilizes a cluster of related concerns in both this 1593 treatise. Remember, it's the treatise on law that precedes his treatise on theology. But in the 1593 treatise on God, natural law and human law, and his 1594 treatise on true theology, the issues in both of these revolve in similar ways around, well, the creator-creature distinction, the necessity of accommodating either God's goodness, law, or accommodating God's knowledge, theology, to human beings, and a posture of epistemic humility in the exercise of the disciplines of law and theology, respectively. For Junius, in the discipline of law, this humility is evident in careful deliberation on the common good and the moral law for this life. And in the discipline of theology, this humility is evident in recognizing differing degrees of the work of God's grace among God's people in preparation for the next life. At a time when there is renewed interest in our day in the utility of natural law and its role in public life, this is not new ground for Protestants or something foreign to the Reformed tradition. Quite the contrary. If the terminology and distinctions seem foreign to modern ears, it is we who have sojourned too long in foreign territory. Junius's work on the Mosaic Law represents a thoughtful piece of theology that seeks to distinguish clearly between nature and grace, and in so doing charts a principled path by which the magistrate can work for the common good in this life, while the church seeks to work by grace here and now to prepare for the next one. It is for this reason that the works of theologians like Junius should be studied, both to correct modern scholarship on the history of natural law within Reformed theology, but also to enrich contemporary discussions of Reformed approaches to the civil magistrate that represent a holistic approach to theology and civic life. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an amazing panel. You all stay right on target. You know that? That's great. Professor Sytsma, how much time will you need? You're going to do something a little different, aren't you?
Yeah, I might need a little less, actually.
Okay.
I won't need too much.
Are we well positioned to see what you're going to do there?
I think so.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and not talk about what Junius thinks himself, but talk about a thing we're calling Junius Institute Digital Companion, the first of which appears here. This is a project, it's a group project that we've developed. Of course, we're using Dr. Noe's translation on the left here, English translation. Todd Rester has developed a book scanner and was able to take images of a Heckman Library version of Junius's 1613 opera. These are columns from Junius's opera over at Calvin College's Heckman Library. And then I've been able to put these pieces together into what we're calling a companion, which will facilitate the comparison between the English and the Latin text for scholars. So that's the primary purpose of this companion. And then another purpose of this companion is to take advantage of unique opportunities that are afforded from the digital medium as opposed to the print medium, which is a good thing. The print medium is good for reasons I'll be talking about, but we want to extend the translation that's available via tools, digital tools. There are some distinct advantages to a digital format. Number one is accessibility. Digital format makes this text available to an international audience via the web. Number two is it can make use of compatible technologies that everyone can access, open source software and different technologies that web browsers use. The third thing is that it affords an opportunity for integration between existing online tools. And a fourth feature of the digital medium that we can take advantage of is the flexibility that it allows us to add features over time to the study of this text. And of course, we also want to promote the long-term stability of a text such as this by working in continuity with the print medium. So that was also a priority in creating this companion tool. All right, so for the implementation, I'd like to demo the implementation of this. So what we have here on the right is we have the ability to focus in and out of the original Latin text to get a cleaner look at it. The entire book and the table of contents is visible, including the introduction by two of our panelists. We've built this with open source software. So if any of you have used archive.org, Internet Archive, this is open source software from that group on the right. So that is free software that we've been able to utilize and modify according to our needs. And then we've also used JavaScript software to interact, to create some interactive tools for the scholar. As far as integration with online resources goes, one thing, of course, that we can do that you can't do in a book, in a printed book, is bring the scholar directly into contact with a primary or secondary source if there is a digital copy available. So earlier, Professor Muller mentioned Junius's original conversation with Arminius that was printed in Latin. The reader can simply bring that up by clicking on the link, or bring up the English translation. We can do this with all available books that are discussed either in the introduction with footnotes or in the text of Junius itself. Okay, so we have direct links to digitized primary sources. Another feature that we can do is integrate plugins that are available on the web. So, for example, I will move to Junius's discussion of supernatural theology. When there is a biblical verse, there will be a biblical verse. Let's keep going. Excuse me. Here we are. Romans. Logos software has a plugin that we're able to use that'll automatically convert all verse references to a pop-up window so you can immediately see what's being referred to. And we have, of course, included the scripture index at the end that you can jump to each of those verses. So it helps with it has an easy-to-use scriptural study built in. Another integrative tool that we are able to use now that I developed personally is anytime there is a mention of a significant person. Tremellius was mentioned, for example, in Professor Muller's introduction to Junius. That person's information will be pulled from another project that we have, the Post-Reformation Digital Library, and put into a little window like this, and you can see the professors, the information of the professorial dates, the number of digital works that are available. If there's a Wikipedia entry, that will be a convenient link. Willem van Asselt has done a great job of discussing a number of different scholars in connection with Junius that lived at the time, and I'll show you down here. You will see at the end he concludes with a number of, here you have Amandus Planus, Johann Alsted, and so on. All of these authors you'll be able to follow up and search through their digital works. Another thing that we have, a sub-project of the Post-Reformation Digital Library, is something we call Scholastica, and that is the authors in PRDL, Post-Reformation Digital Library, are arranged by their school. So if you go to, say, Herborn here, it will pull up all the faculty of that university so that you can then go and browse their digital works. So anytime there's a school mentioned, it will integrate into this tool of PRDL. Okay. And then something I haven't mentioned, the English and the Latin are synchronized, so that as you scroll through the text, and we're in the introduction here, but as you scroll through the actual text of Junius, and you hit a new Latin page, it will automatically update on the right side. So the Latin is synchronized to the English, which will allow you to study the Latin more easily. Okay. And then another thing that we're worried about is the stability of the text. So one thing that's always a problem with texts that become digitized is the lack of permanence. That's an inherent problem to the digital medium. And so if this website disappears at some point, we want to make sure that references to the work won't that there's still a permanent base to the study that can go on with work such as this, which is why we have included page references both to the English and the Latin. So if you hover over the page, it will tell you the exact page reference that you're looking at in the print version. Likewise, for the Latin, it will tell you exactly what the reference is, so you can cite that easily. Okay. And then these page references also allow for an easy link for people to reference to specific pages. So, for example, at the end of the work, there are scripture and subject indexes. These are page numbers that can be pulled up directly, so there's a continuity between the print and the online version. Okay, what does the future hold for this companion project? One thing we're toying with, but this would be a lot more work yet, is to create a transcription of this Latin of these Latin images on the right, and then allow the reader to toggle back and forth between the images and the plain text. And this would allow a number of things. It would allow, of course, you to search for certain Latin terms real easily. It would also allow for a tool such as a tool that's on Corpus Thomisticum, if you're familiar with that website. If you were to double-click on a word, it pulls up the Latin word study tool at Perseus, so you can study the Latin quite easily. And we could integrate a tool such as that. Not exactly this, but we could integrate a tool more easily that would work with the plain text. And then there's also the issue of what do you do with information that you wish you would have included in a print edition, but now that the text has gone to print, you would like to add more information, and you notice certain things after the fact. There are, of course, added footnotes that we could add to the web edition that we could distinguish from the print at some time in the future. For example, it's not in your print edition, but in his discussion of natural theology, Franciscus Junius refers to the supernatural gifts as being lost and the natural gifts as being corrupted, and he says the Orthodox Church Fathers and Scholastics had this distinction. Well, this is something that comes right out of Calvin. It's very obvious. Calvin refers to Augustine and Lombard specifically, but Junius refers to the Orthodox Fathers and Scholastics. He has the exact same distinction. This is something we may want to point out, but it's not in your print edition, so we could add notes to that effect in this online edition. Okay, so Junius is On True Theology. This is a trial run. This companion for our digital companion format, and we're still working on smoothing out some of the rough edges of the software. But once we do, we think we'll be able to replicate this quite easily for future translations as well. What's the timeline for the release? We are not going to release this for 6 months from the original book release, which puts this digital companion public release at no earlier than mid-April, which means that if you want to read Junius's text, you're going to have to buy the book. So we encourage you to do that before that time. Okay?
Dr. Sytsma, thank you very much. All I want to say is that in the life hereafter, you two young men are going to have to spend a lot of time getting Gutenberg up to speed. This is remarkable technology, and we wish you well in that venture. I'd like to give the panelists each, in the sequence in which they presented, an opportunity to make an additional comment or ask a question of a fellow panelist. David?
Thank you. I wanted to ask Professor Sytsma, David, with this digital companion and placing the Latin right next to the English, was it your express intention to make it really easy for people to find my errors?
I don't know how to answer that. Now, as I was actually working through this, yeah, you do start to notice things when you compare. Mm-hmm. So we can follow up on that in private.
It's a kind of a freighted response.
Richard.
Just a comment just further on that. One of the great problems of rendering this literature into English is just how do you translate some of the technical terms? And you could translate them 3 different ways and still not satisfy every reader. I always note this when I look at Calvin's Institutes and pull my hair out over the Battles translation. You just can't leave it the way it is. You have to fix it. You have to tinker with it, and hopefully, and it's not a matter of even saying the text is wrong. It's a matter of the translation is wrong. What exactly is going on here is the question, and this is a way of getting at that. It's getting always past the translation into the original, and this is an avenue into the thought world of Junius, and we hope it works that way, hope it functions that way.
It almost seems as if you're making an argument for studying Latin, almost.
Yeah, one could say that. One could say that.
Todd.
Well, and that, on the heels of that comment, that it makes a case for studying Latin. What it does is it shows you that we have a panel of 4 or 5 scholars up here, and it takes all of us to study what Junius did on his own. Here's a man who was versed in law, classics, and theology by the age of 13, and spent his life working in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And what was not mentioned, but was certainly the case, was because of those particular things, he was involved in many of the diplomatic discussions of his day, and being called upon to serve the state in a variety of ways. So here's a man who is not only a theologian and a Hebrew scholar, but also is playing an active role in the civic life. So yeah, the more I read someone, you read his little piece on the Mosaic polity, and then you read his piece on the treatise on true theology, and I guess what struck me in the middle of that was the utility of this creator-creature distinction and the way it gets played out and the archetypal and ectypal distinctions and the way he's using it to talk about the doctrine of accommodation and setting up the need for Scripture in his life. So there's a fruitful area of study. Karl Barth at the end of his life, and also notes this in the introduction, but Karl Barth at the end of his life made the comment that these seemingly abstruse distinctions, if they would have been attended to, the history of modern theology would have gone much better. That's a fascinating comment.
It wasn't an end-of-life critique of his own work, I think.
I hope so.
Anything from you at this point?
I don't think so at this point.
I would like to add, if I could, that
Sure.
The language problem that Richard was mentioning, both he and Van Asselt gave me a great deal of help in trying to pick the proper terminology, because it is very difficult, as you mentioned, to take some of these terms of art and decide which should be translated by English derivatives, which should be translated in a more poetic and flourishing way, as a classicist is wont to do. Of course, they should never be translated as battles would have, right? That's the... I'm being facetious.
We could battle over that.
But there was a great deal of contribution from other scholars in the selection of terminology, for which I'm thankful.
When I read the Van Asselt essay, it for the first time made Abraham Kuyper's Principles of Sacred Theology intelligible to me. His distinction between archetypal and ectypal theology. That essay alone is worth the price of this book, or twice the price of this book. That is a magnificent, magnificent essay. And so is your paragraph on the work of a translator. I've done a lot of translating, but I found that was a very perceptive paragraph on what goes into translating and how to do that well. So this is a remarkable book. I'd recommend it to all of you, especially the introductory material. The biographical stuff is also fascinating.
Yeah, I think Todd said, or maybe it was Jay, I don't know. It's the first RHB book to which the movie rights have already been purchased. Because of the...
We can dream.
Well, if you gentlemen have nothing to add by way of comment to each other or interaction, let's throw it open for questions or comments from the audience. Who would like to be first in placing a question or making a comment?
I was going to volunteer to walk around the microphone, so Todd doesn't have to. Yeah. Well, I can ask David something real quick, and it's more of just a little technical point. Well, let me preface it by saying you've obviously put a fantastic amount of work into this, and it's a fantastic tool. And so thank you to RHB for publishing the work, and thank you to David Noe for doing the work of translation that's made something like this possible. Can you scroll through the right-hand side and have the left-hand side change too?
No, it's not set up that way.
Okay. That was just a little question.
A room full of theologians.
I asked the first one, so that was the easy one. Or the hard one, I guess. The rest of these are easy.
The only person who would want to do that is someone who knows Latin better than English.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I learned even more about Junius than I had from reading the introduction. A question I had after reading the introduction was, Van Asselt makes reference to Junius's Irenicum, and it does strike me that topic has kind of seen a renewed kind of desire among certain Reformed circles in America for a more ironic, or like I learned at Reformed Theological Seminary, a winsome Reformed theology, as the word that they used all the time. Has anyone read that up here in the panel or dabbled into it and know anything about what his vision was for a more ironic Reformed church? Just curious.
Go ahead. Say something?
Go ahead.
I've started translating part of it. It's in 2 books, and it's translated the first 20 pages or so. It's a meditation on 2 psalms. It's a meditation on Psalm 130. Is it 134? How good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell. Is that 134? Someone must know. And then the other psalm, I can't remember the identification of it. It's an extended meditation on those 2 psalms in 2 books. And it was published in French, right, immediately as well. But I don't think it has ever been put in any other language.
What I was going to say was, in this work, one of the points that Junius makes is he's talking about the need for theology in this life, theologia in hacuita, sometimes called pilgrim theology. And in the middle of that discussion, he talks about that Scripture is the objective truth of God. It's the work of God's Spirit that teaches us and leads us to a clearer knowledge of God. But then he also talks about the subjective work of the Spirit in individuals. And I think he sets up the project of the Irenicum on a corporate level by talking about this individual aspect, that on the subjective level, there's different amounts of, if you will, fallen nature that are still at work in human beings. And there's different levels of grace that are at work in different human beings. And then there's different understandings in the middle of all of that. And so what that does is it sets up an environment where you have to labor to understand each other. Just from the simple fact that God is at work in different ways among different people and at different levels. And so he makes that observation in here, just in his prolegomena, as just a matter of common distinction. There's an objective discussion. We can speak about Scripture. There's an a subjective aspect of theology. And I think he's thinking hard on that topic, the realization that the Spirit of God is at work in people at different levels. And there's people that have different gifts of intelligence and et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think, the wellspring of some of his conversation about the need for irenic engagement. It's the realization that the Spirit's at work.
Did I see somebody? Oh, John.
Todd, I'm really interested in the piece that you talked about, the question of to what extent Mosaic law is still to be applied to civil life today. When Bavinck gave a paper to the First Christian Social Congress, which is the one where Kuyper gave his famous problem of poverty address, it was on that exact topic. I wish I had the exact title with me. It's about 3 sentences long, and it's Victorian in all of its characteristics. But it has to do with precisely that question: to what extent do the Mosaic principles still serve as a guideline for civil life today? And it struck me that if that's 1594, how close this was to Calvin, where Calvin makes exactly the same point in Book 420, the opening of 420. And I guess the question I had is, did you find out anything more about the subsequent attention to that question in either the period of Orthodoxy itself or later than that? Because jumping from 1594 to 1891 is a big jump. And the Puritans addressed some of these questions, but probably not in exactly the same way. So what else was done in that subsequent period?
Well, I can't speak globally to that particular what else was done between 1594 and Kuyper. But what I can say with some, I'm incredibly happy to note that there are other scholars who are interested in this question in the 1590s and using Junius. There was a recent paper delivered by Brad Littlejohn at the 16th Century Society and Conference where he was looking at Hooker in an English context and Junius and comparing them. In much of the scholarship, he makes the point, in much of the scholarship, Hooker is viewed as an outlier. And what he does is he brings that into conversation with Junius and says there's more continuity, more commonality than folks have originally understood. And so I think what this does is it shows us we need to get back into the sources. We need to get back into the period. And we need, in order to understand some of our modern thinkers and those like Kuyper and others, we really do have to have a really firm grip on what's going on in this period. But with Junius, yes, as far as who are his precursors, you could pick up the work of Donellus in legal theory on the Justinian Code, and you find similar language about natural law. You find similar language about human law and divine law. And of course, you can find it theologically in Calvin. And so I wonder how much of it is just, quote, in the period. The fact that he can cite something that sounds so close to Thomas Aquinas without citing him. And no one critiques him, as far as I'm aware, for making those points. So there's an aspect here where you've got an opportunity for further dialogue among the Reformed. The next person I would check on this would be Futsius. Given Futsius's usage of the Spanish Dominicans, frequently deploying them against the Jesuits, I I would think that it's interesting that in the mid-17th century you've got this nice appropriation back and forth between some of the Dominicans and the Reformed, and that's involved. So my hunch is I would want to go there and see what's going on in the mid-1650s and 1660s along those lines.
Obviously, there's an awful lot more ammunition to fire at Russian army.
If one would choose such a small target.
I would be remiss in not mentioning that Todd's working on a translation of Junius's On the Observation of the Mosaic Polity. There's a selection, an initial selection of it that appears in the Journal of Markets Morality, which is the same place that John's translation of Bobbing's paper on the use of the Old Testament for addressing the social question today also appears. And that full translation is going to be out at some point soon, and Drew McGinnis in the back there is working on editing it with Todd. So, FYI.
Hopefully by the end of the year.
Yeah. So we're experiencing a kind of new flowering of interest in primary sources related to Junius, which this treatise on true theology has inaugurated. Other questions?
Dr. Muller, you made an interesting comment about the Leiden theses, it being set up in a particular pattern. Did that set the pattern for theological theses, for the day? Is that the first time that occurred in a set pattern like that?
I'm not sure. I've spent a lot of time, because that's begun to bother me when I was thinking about saying that, and I spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks downloading theses from PRDL by professors in specific institutions, particularly Heidelberg, to see if I could line them up chronologically. It's going to take me a while here, and see if they were doing anything like this. I don't know, because you do have other places, most of them later, like Sedan and Saumur, where the professors do print up major syllabuses of their theses that are, again, an institutional representation of their theology. Junius, Kuchlinus, and Trocasius Sr. did publish one of their series of theses in the 1590s. Other professors in other places, they did it in Geneva in the 1580s. So there's a sense in which you do produce a body of doctrine. What Junius seems to have introduced that I don't see elsewhere is doing it in repetitions. So you cycle through the students, and then when that group is done, you begin again at the beginning. And that pattern keeps on going. You have a set of the disputations, which I've never seen. I don't think it's ever been made available digitally, where Junius and that generation published a set. The next set, that was, I guess, the fourth repetition, which has Comarus, Arminius, and Trocasius Jr., that was also published, and it was actually published, it was in print in the 16 teens, which is interesting because Arminius was dead and not of happy memory in many places. But they still published the corporate theology that included his disputations. And then, of course, you have the major synopsis Furioris of the next generation doing a similar kind of thing. And then on the other side of it, you've got professors extracting their own disputations, like Arminius and Comarus, publishing them separately. So that the pattern of publishing these things, that was established, and probably before Junius and his group actually published their set. What Junius did that was different, I think, is getting them to go in these repetitions and sort of bringing the theology around as each group of students passes out, another group comes in. And often rewriting the disputation so that the first, second repetition disputations are not identical to the third, fourth, fifth. Comarus would do a disputation in one cycle, and even the same topic, come up with a different one in the next cycle. Different words, much the same content.
So a follow-up question to that is, in the collected works, can you distinguish what years the Leiden theses were?
Sometimes. In Arminius' works, his public disputations do have those identifiers. Homerists don't. And so you can't really tell by looking at the works whether they're from Leiden or later from Vernier. The best way to get this is to get from one of those libraries the publication for the disputations. Then you have this little pamphlet that documents the day. And there's enormous numbers of those floating around, and increasing numbers being digitalized, or digitized, whichever you like.
Thank you.
I want to give Dr. Sytsma a chance to ask a question.
And just to follow up on this issue of disputation cycles, you seem to indicate that Junius was responsible for that first cycle in theology at Leiden, right?
Potentially he Cofelinus, and Trocasius Sr.
Yeah, they were all together. As I understand it, the first disputation cycle in theology was basically initiated after the pattern of a disputation cycle in the law faculty at Leiden. And also, of course, as you mentioned, other universities had the pattern of a cycle, although maybe not with the repetitions. I haven't seen the repetitions elsewhere either. I don't know if you found that in any other universities. But one final comment. The University of Amsterdam in the archives has a magnificent collection of a catalog of disputations of all the Dutch universities done by van der Woude. I was just there a few weeks ago. It's just a magnificent collection, and you can reconstruct all of these cycles just by going through his catalog. So it's a wonderful resource to use.
Stanglin did use that when he put together that whole volume
Yes.
of the missing disputations, and that he's got an appendix where he's pretty much reconstructed all the cycles.
Yeah, he did it with some cycles, but there are more cycles. Also, after the synopsis, this goes on for a century or so later, but those very early cycles can all be reconstructed. One thing, just in terms of what you say about Stanglin's work, Stanglin makes a mistake in understanding the nature of those repetitions. He basically identifies repetition with a cycle, so every cycle is a repetition. But in actual fact, a repetition is just that. There's an original cycle, and then that's followed by cycles that are called repetitions. And you find that beginning again with the synopsis. So the the synopsis of 1625 is sort of considered an original cycle. And then there are repetitions that follow that for a number of times.
There's somebody down here. Yeah. Am I missing somebody? Sorry.
How does Junius's distinction between God's own theology and the theology belonging to the mediator and the theology belonging to us lay a theoretical foundation to bring together, on the one hand, an absolute confidence in the infallibility of Scripture with a profound humility on the part of those who are actually doing theology?
Take a stab at it?
One of the characteristics of what he's doing is he is distinguishing between the revelation itself, as in Scripture, and the modes of knowing. So that for us, we have Scripture as the basis of what we know, because the mode of our knowing is by revelation. Christ's mode of knowing is by union, angels and the blessed heavens mode of knowing is by vision. So that we can't have it by union, we can't have it by vision, but we can have it by revelation. And then he pretty clearly distinguishes also between what Adam could have had and what we have. And when you get down the chain, that, once you say what we've got is ectypal, and it's not nearly as good as union, not nearly as good as vision, it's just by revelation. We have to base it on Scripture, which is already placed into our way of knowing. And then we have to do it after the fall and in individual, diverse, and fallible subjects, so that the end result is humility. Humility because of who you are, even over against the source.
There's also something that's going on in this period that's also very interesting. Gerhard and Quinstedt, two Lutheran theologians of the 17th century, reference Junius on the De Vera. So they're utilizing elements of his prolegomenal structure in their own formulations. Now, the polemical point here is that by establishing this, if you will, the Christ's ectypal knowledge, that is the theology of union, so this is the hypostatic union, that is, this is the knowledge of God accommodated to the work of the mediator. So what he's doing is that allows the space to talk about, in a Lutheran context where you have this, there's a great debate over what is exactly the communication of attributes between the divine and human natures. So what this does, it puts a uniquely, if you will, reformed spin on things. You're able to have this conversation where you say, well, in this construction, Christ can develop and grow in his understanding. He can grow in grace and knowledge. He can be ignorant of certain facts. And so this is, you can see this deployed this way in Walaeus in the mid-17th century, building on Junius, who was one of, so let's see if I can trace it, Junius, Chamarus, and then Walaeus, in that order. But it becomes a point where he's differing, in Walaeus especially, he's differing with the Lutherans, but he's also differing with the Roman Catholics. Some of the Roman Catholic theologians had maintained that what Christ has in his knowledge is a beatific vision, a complete beatific vision that is unique and different from ours, but it's a beatific vision that's archetypal in nature, that begins in the conception and continues out through his whole life. So there's an element here just in the prolegomena that is, if you will, part of this epistemological conversation about what exactly is the knowledge of Christ in the God-man. And so that's part of that point. So he's trying to set that up. And then for the work of the believer, some of the ways this gets deployed in the 17th century is some folks were saying that they could be perfectionists by the work of the Spirit. They wouldn't need Scripture. And the rejoinder was to use the distinctions Junius made and citing Junius, was to use the distinctions that Junius made and then turn around and say, there is no place in the Scriptures where, whether you're mature or whether you're weak, that you would not need the Scriptures. There is no point in this life before you gain the beatific vision of God that you would not need the Scriptures. Therefore, you cannot go down this line. So that humility, it puts us in the posture of dependence epistemically. That's my stab at it.
Speaking of humility, I think that I have the privilege of being the editorial director of RHB and reading, doing the final editing of all the books we publish. And when I finished this book, I was absolutely amazed at the tumultuousness of his life in the first part. I mean, if he wasn't exaggerating, this guy was living on the edge all the time. And then the profundity and the nuance of his theology. How could he think so minutely when his life is always on the edge of being killed or being thrown into prison or something? And then I started thinking about Calvin and the other reformers and the Puritans and how many of them did their theology in the midst of the kind of environment we have in Psalm 46, the tumultuousness of the mountains rolling into the seas and everything. And it dawned on me that maybe some of our best theologians and our best theology comes in the midst of this incredible experiential dynamic of going through all kinds of troubles and trials in life, and God uses that to bring us to greater theological depth. So when I finished the book, it really humbled me that this man could produce this kind of prolegomena while he's living in the environment he's living in. And that certainly is a testimony of the amazing grace of God. Thank you.
Very apt comment. Thanks, Dr. Beakey. When I read the Vanassel introduction, I was struck by his contribution in bringing together theoretical and practical divinity, and how that's a template for so much 17th and early 18th century theology. Whether you take Ben Maastricht, on which the two of you are working, or whether you take Brakel, theoretical and practical divinity, it just is that one of the reasons that you picked Junius as the name for your institute? Elaborate on that institute, its purpose, and how you came to do that.
The institute came. I mean, when we looked at Junius, we just looked. I mean, you can tell the interests that he has. What was one of the great secrets of the 16th century, as far as Bibles is concerned, is the legacy of the Junius Tremelius text. Went through about 25 different editions from its first publication in 1579 through its last full edition in around 1725 in Zurich. But elements of it were used throughout, even up through the 19th century. And this text was frequently paired with Beza. So there's this issue of there's a deep concern for the text of the Scriptures. There's a deep concern for the study of the theology of the Scriptures. You also note with something like the True Theology, his contributions to prolegomena in the shape of Reformed theology. One of the other points that you notice is he is a fertile thinker in terms of the interaction between theology and law. And then we'll also have a gentleman who is right in the middle of the persecuted church in Antwerp. You'll read, I think, with much profit, some of the account of his labor in the shadow of the Spanish persecution in Belgium and that sort of thing. So what you find in Junius is you find someone who is concerned about the sources, he's concerned about the text, he's concerned about theology, and he really is a wellspring. I want to be very careful not to elevate him as some pole star, but he's a transitional figure who bridges the Reformation period into the post-Reformation period. He is doing that point where he talks about theology of pilgrims, that is, in this life and in the next life, is both theoretical and practical. So that there's a wonderful nexus of all sorts of interests. And so that was sort of why I think in our discussions among David and Jordan and Dr. Muller and Albert Hoches, who is abroad, and many others in the doctoral program at Calvin that have kind of put that as, well, let's talk about this transitional figure and see where this goes.
I'm working through Abraham Kuyper's 40 years of his religious periodical called The Herald, basically focusing on his devotions. But he takes 50 or 60 issues in the early 1880s when one of his colleagues reprints huge, long excerpts from Junius, which I connected to your project. I mean, he for Kuyper was a very strategic and instrumental figure.
He was, Kuyper, you may know Kuyper put out a Bibliotheca Reformata, and it was his intent to put out Latin sources of the early Reformed theologians. So you have someone like, you have commentaries on the Heidelberg Catechism, I believe, by Vestingius, but the first one is Junius.
Is that right?
The very first volume where he started with was on through the True Theology, his Vita, his Theses Theologicae, and some of his others.
In addition, Richard was saying at the beginning that Junius is often plagiarized. So if you read through the treatise on True Theology, I don't remember which chapter it's in, but Junius develops an elaborate metaphor of a tree, a healthy tree. I can't remember which chapter it is. And if you read Jim Bratt's recent biography of Kuyper, you'll find Kuyper employing the same metaphor and not crediting Junius.
Shame on you.
Well,
Good 16th century fashion.
clearly he was highly influenced by Junius.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very rich and full evening, and I'm sure that these panelists would be willing to converse with any of you who want to linger afterwards. But let's show our appreciation to them for their contributions tonight. And I want to thank all of you, some of you who have come from some distance to be part of this evening, and we have a little door prize for you. There are some refreshments outside, so stay and help yourself. With that, we'll call the evening to a conclusion. Thank you.
If you would like to find out more information about the Junius Institute, you've probably been seeing information flash up here. There's also sign-up sheets if you'd like to be on our email list. Don't worry, we don't sell it, we don't spam you. But if you're interested in the colloquia that we do throughout the year, please sign up for that, and you will receive more information throughout the year.
And the Reformation Heritage book people have a table outside.
As well as
And the Dutch Reformed Translation Society has a table here, and you can find out about the work of both places.
and Baker Academic.
And Baker Academic is out in the hall as well. So linger over the tables.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.